Hops are a pretty crazy plant. They are a cousin to cannabis, and they grow flowers called cones. They grow super, super tall. They grow on vines, super, super tall. They're technically called vines. And then inside those cone flowers are the essential oils that I mentioned earlier. And each variety of hop contains different amounts of different essential oils. And those essential oils smell and taste like things that are not hops. For instance, this strain, this varietal is Azaka. And you can hopefully see, oh, not even a little bit can you see that? There we go. So this hop is going to taste and smell like apricot, ripe mango, orchard fruit, and pine. And none of those things are actually in this bag. They are all the oils and other compounds from the hop cone flower. And I just think it's absolutely crazy. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of varieties of hops. More are being developed every day. They are, cultivated for those specific flavors. And there are some pretty common flavors in hops. When you're talking about hops from Europe, they tend to be spicy, herbal, floral. When you talk about hops from the Pacific Northwest in the United States, they tend to be citrusy, piney, resiny. But you can also have hops that taste like coconut or strawberry or blueberries. And so those things were cultivated for those crazy, unique flavors. And again, there's not mango or apricot or fruit in this bag. It is just pellet hops. So I want to make sure that I'm in ounces, not grams. So there are the Azaka hops. So they will sell them as a whole cone flour, but what's more popular these days are pellets. So they grind up the hop and then send it through an extruder that turns it into these pellets. And they tend to dissolve into the wort, so you get sometimes better extraction of the alpha acids and oils and everything else you're going for. Not always. I also use whole cone flours. It's just that the pellets have become more standardized. More people sell pellets than they sell cones. So we're getting pretty frothy on top. It takes a long time to get this amount of liquid up to boil, especially on my tiny apartment stove. Some people buy huge propane grills and brew outside in like a pot big enough to boil a turkey in. I'm not quite there yet. So we're approaching 200 degrees Fahrenheit, so we're getting closer. And then the next kind of hop that we're going to be using today is Cascade. This is a super popular hop. This hop pretty much helped the craft beer revolution in the United States in the 80s. For instance, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, one of the first craft brews widely distributed, uses 100% Cascade hops. Anchor Steam's Liberty Ale uses Cascade hops. It's got that pretty common citrusy grapefruit pine thing going on. And then just a little bit of floral. we need an entire ounce of this one. Alright, so I now have these stacked in the order that I'm going to need them. So we're going to start with the Irish moss and yeast nutrient. Then 5 minutes we're going to put the Azaka at flame out. We're going to do the Cascade. And then the Citra I probably won't weigh out and use for another few days. Getting real foamy now. Clean as we go. So the other thing we need to do before this beer is done, or wort I should say, there's a saying that brewers make wort, yeast make beer, because it's not technically beer until it's got alcohol in it. So the last thing we need to do before this wort is done is get the keg ready for fermentation. So we're going to do no chill into the fermenter, which means that I'm not going to chill the wort down before I put it in. We're going to do a short hop stand, which means that once my 30 minutes is up for my boil, I'm going to add that ounce of Cascade hops at 0 minutes, and then give it a good stir, and then I'm going to turn the flame off, and it's going to lose a few degrees, but we're still going to be well above 190 Fahrenheit, if not 200 Fahrenheit, when it goes into the keg. So the keg currently has Star San in it, and it's been sanitizing for a few days now. I flipped it over upside down this morning to make sure the Star San got into every nook and cranny. And so we're going to get the Star San out. I've got my CO2 tank set up right here. You can see it in the keg. And I'm going to fill this bowl with sanitizer to use to sanitize anything that I might need sanitized. It's also a good time to double check that the keg will hold pressure. So I've got about 5-6 psi pressure of CO2 on the keg right now. Everything seems to be holding. At this point, there should be enough pressure in the keg that I can kill the CO2, and it is still pushing out liquid. Alright, we're gonna let that go. I'm gonna grab my CIP film and my keg wrench. So we can take this thing apart, make sure it's ready to go. The other thing we're gonna need to do is prep this floating dip tube, which I'll show you in a second. Once I get it out, I'm not gonna be able to get it back in. Bowl is filled with sanitizer. This thing really, really wants to boil. So you can see it's just covered in thick, thick foam now. If I stir it, some of that material will start to go back into solution. Now it's back to mostly, still mostly foam. All that hot break. We're over 200, 207. Ooh, it's starting to talk. It's starting to talk just a little bit. Okay. So I've got the gas disconnected. I'm going to take this beer line off. This disconnect is a little bit sticky, so I'm actually going to soak it in the sanitizer as well. This keg is mostly empty, I can tell now. We're going to release the pressure. Take off the lid. Overend fell off, but that's okay. We're going to put all of this into the sanitizer. I'm going to take the pressure release valve off. Like that. Get my timer ready to go. It's not quite boiling yet, but I think it will be soon. Get it set for 30 minutes. But we won't start it just yet. let's take this keg apart. First, we're going to take the liquid post off, and the liquid dip tube is what we're actually going to replace with the new floating dip tube. And you'll see in a second that the liquid dip tube is a very, very long, skinny tube that goes almost all the way down to the bottom of this 5-gallon keg. Because I'm going to be fermenting in this keg, there's going to be quite a bit of yeast when we're done, which is what we want. And when we're done, all of the yeast is going to be on the bottom. So this liquid dip tube, if I left it in and went to pull beer off, would suck up a lot of that yeast, which I don't want. I want that yeast to stay where it is. Some people will cut, a good inch and a half off the end of their liquid dip tube, but I don't want to do that. I don't have a pipe cutter, don't want to buy a pipe cutter, and I would rather keep the dip tubes intact so that in the future, if I do decide to ferment in another vessel and then transfer it into the keg, I still have a dip tube that's going to reach all the way to the bottom and get every last ounce of beer. I actually have a West Coast IPA that I'm going to be brewing once these 2 beers that I've made are gone, so maybe in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to be fermenting in like a traditional fermenter, not in the keg, and that's because it's going to have quite a bit of dry hopping, much more than just this ounce that we're adding into this one, and it'll just be easier to add the dry hops and then take the beer off the hops if I use my regular fermenter. This is really threatening to boil, so I don't want to keep my eyes off of it for too long. I'm going to turn the flame down just a teach. Alright, I'm going to go store this. It's not a rolling boil by any means, but it is now producing bubbles in 2 spots, so I'm going to say it is time to start our timer. The boil will probably get more vigorous as we go on, but our 30-minute boil timer is now on. Alright, if you guys see this start to boil over, let me know in the chat. So we'll take the gas dip tube out next. So the gas dip tube is pretty small. Its only purpose is to introduce CO2 into the keg. You can see it's significantly shorter than the liquid tube. I'm going to take the O-ring off, put the bolt in the sanitizer. Alright, so now all of the pieces that we're going to take off of this are off. We got to get the rest of the sanitizer. Next, I like to do a visual inspection of the keg, especially up around the top where it's hard to see, to make sure we don't have any crusty material from a previous beer. Go grab a brush. If anyone watched my last video, you might remember my super shitty bottle brush. It's still here. It really wasn't that bad. There were just a couple of things that I wanted to get out just in case. Splash of sanitizer in there. I'm using Star Sand, which is a no rinse sanitizer, meaning that you can let it air dry and it won't affect the quality of your beverage or add any, well, it will add flavor if you add too much. So I'm just going to make sure all of the sides are coated in sanitizer. And then we'll take it out. I believe Star Sand has a 2-minute contact time to sanitize. So we're going to let it sit like that. There is still sanitizer on all the sides. It's just kind of dripping down. This is definitely a nice boil now. We do still have some hot break material on top, which is fine. As the boil goes on, we're going to lose all that. It's going to get stirred back into solution. And then at the end of the boil, we're going to leave it in the kettle. And last time, my battery died right as we got to that part, so I couldn't show you what was left in the bottom of the kettle, but I'm going to try to do that this time. There are pros and cons to leaving this stuff behind. Some people dump their whole kettle into the fermenter and they don't have any issues. Some people worry that it will affect clarity. So with a beer that's going to be this light in color, it's going to be a real pale yellow. I don't want it to look muddy or hazy or cloudy at all. It won't affect the taste, but it'll affect the experience of drinking it. I want to be able to hold it up and see through the beer, like, you know, like a Bud Light or a Coors Light. Those are known for being super see-through. If I add all of these proteins, all of the hot break, to the fermenter, they will probably settle to the bottom with all of the yeast at the end of fermentation. Then there's a risk of when you then go to refrigerate the beer, you have what's called chill haze. And chill haze is when all of these, the proteins and starches and hazy compounds are still in the beer, and then they get cold. It actually makes the beer cloudy. So one of the best ways to eliminate that is to put clear wort into your fermenter, and you'll get clear beer at the end. Like I said, some people dump their whole kettle in and don't experience any issues. It's really up to the brewer. The other reason that I want to leave as much of this behind is that I am going to be fermenting 3.5 gallons in this keg, and it's a 5-gallon keg. So that leaves me 1.5 gallons of what's called headspace. As the yeast ferment the beer, they get really fluffy, and the CO2 lifts a lot of the yeast and a lot of the material up to the top, and it forms what's called the krausen. So the krausen looks like fluffy clouds on top of the beer. And in my experience, I've noticed that when I add all of the proteins and all of the hot break, that krausen gets much bigger than it would if I left all of it behind. Because I'm brewing in the keg, I am going to have the pressure release valve off, so there's no risk of it clogging. So if the Krausen reaches all the way to the top of the keg, it could plug that pressure release valve if it were installed. I'm going to take it out, but it could cause it to overflow. And there's a way to fix that with a blow-off tube, yada yada yada, but I would just rather have the headspace and know that I have enough room for it. There's also a product called Firm Cap that reduces the Krausen and the foam in the beer. And so there's some people who will brew and ferment like a 4.5 gallon batch in a 5 gallon corny keg, which seems to be cutting it close to me. But I guess it's really only dangerous if you are doing a pressure fermentation where you're allowing some of that CO2 to build up, and if your pressure release valve or your spunding valve get clogged, then you are just creating a pressure bomb. So that's most of the foam is gone now. I feel confident this is not going to boil over. We've got about 11.5 minutes until I need to add anything to this wort, so I'm going to keep working on the keg. This has definitely had 2 minutes of contact time now, so it's looking pretty good. And this is kind of all extra precautions. Because we're doing no chill, this wort is going to enter that fermenter above 190 degrees, if not above 200 degrees. And that's going to be hot enough to kill anything in the keg that would otherwise cause it to be infected. So this is just overkill. I already had sanitizer in the keg. Might as well do a nice clean job on it and make sure everything is sanitized. So next we're going to add our dip tube. So this actually goes to a Firmzilla fermenter. This is a silicone tubing. At least the other one I bought was silicone. This one doesn't look like silicone. This one looks like vinyl. So I'm going to double check that it is in fact silicone before I install it, because if it's not, silicone dip tube. Okay. It's just not as opaque as some silicone is. So the reason I want to double check is that silicone tubing can handle hot temperatures, but vinyl can't. And I definitely don't want to melt vinyl plastic into my beer, because then it would be undrinkable, because it would probably be poison. So this stainless steel ball is going to float at the top of the liquid. This plastic and metal filter are connected to the tube, and then this is going to connect to our liquid outpost. So volume is going to start here. As I drink it over time, the volume is going to go down. It's going to be drawing through this filter, but the ball is going to make sure it stays on top and continues with the liquid down. The reason that that's good for a keg that we're fermenting in is, remember, we talked about all of the yeast that's going to be at the bottom. There's probably going to be a good inch and a half of yeast. And if I had a stainless steel dip tube that went to the bottom, it might suck up a bunch of that yeast, which I don't want. But this guarantees that the out liquid is as far away from the yeast as possible. And then if there are any floaties, like when I go to dry hop this, if some hot particles get out, this stainless steel mesh is going to make sure that nothing ends up in the beer line. So these come long for a Firestone keg, which is what I have. So I'm going to rest this on the bottom, and then I like to give myself just a little bit of wiggle room in case I want to cut it shorter later. Alright, so then this is going to go in the sanitizer. let's see, so we're sanitizing the liquid, and then it comes with a metal post. Looks a lot like the gas dip tube that we have, and it comes with an O-ring. So we're going to take this out of the bag, remove the O-ring, put this in the sanitizer. Clean, sanitized keg, sanitized components. So now we're going to start to put the keg back together. I'm not a big fan of Star San. It's very opaque, and so it's hard to see all of the components that I drop into that bowl. Check our timer here. Got about 6 minutes. Grab a handful of stuff and see what you get. Alright, so those are the posts. I need a gas dip tube. Aha, gas dip tube. Now I need a teeny tiny O-ring. We actually don't need the pressure release valve for a few days, so I'm going to pull that out. Otherwise, it'll just be hard to find everything. Even more difficult than it already is. Probably should have put this stuff into a smaller bowl, eh? It's all a learning process. Oh my goodness. This makes for high quality television, I'm sure. How's my boil doing? Oh, it's looking pretty good. Okay. So we've got a sanitized gas dip tube, sanitized O-ring. Anything rubber is going to get a little bit of this CIP film, which is a food safe lubricant. It helps make sure everything seals better, and it's going to extend the lifetime of all of these rubber pieces. Prevents them from drying out. So here's our gas tube. This is the side that the gas goes on. Now we need our gas post, which is the one with a notch in it. But we also need our spring and other part of our poppet. Gas post, I should say. Alright, so again, everything rubber. So we've got this top valve of our poppet's got a little bit of rubber to it. And the top of the post has some rubber to it. Small side of the spring goes down first. Put your finger over it. So then when you flip it over, the spring doesn't fall out. Hold it down so you can start to thread it. Got the spring popping it out. And now your hands are covered in grease, so it's hard to hold things. It's my favorite part. Get our wrench to finish off tightening it. We're going to tighten until it goes snug like that. And then we're going to give it one more just to make sure. Looks pretty good. So now we need our new liquid dip tube, which is teeny tiny. Right here. And then we need another small O-ring. Right here. A little bit of grease. A little bit of butter. A little bit of dirt. It's Bob's Burgers reference. Anyone? Our new liquid dip tube. Now we need a liquid post. Okay. Grease for all the greasy bits. Top of the poppet. Top of the post. Small side goes down. Pull it with your finger. Push down to start screwing it on the threads until your greasy little fingers can't twist it anymore. Finish it off with the wrench until it goes snug. Give it one more. My wrench is covered in food lubricant. Alright. Next comes one of my least favorite parts. Ooh, we're at 10 minutes, so we're going to add our yeast nutrient and Irish moss. And we want this to interact with all of the wort, so we're not going to put it into the hop spider. We're going to put it into the big part, into the main section here. Keep giving it a nice stir. Alright, now we've got about 4 minutes. Feed this part in. Find our liquid line here. Get the end of the tubing a little bit hot, more pliable. This is so far my least favorite part of these floating dip tubes. Trying to get them on the liquid post. Liquid dip tube, I should say. There we go. Oop, and I pull it back off again. Interesting. It's on. See if I can get it to stay on this time. And I like to get it as far up as it'll go, just so I know it won't slip off. So we've got over 1 centimeter onto the liquid dip tube. Just because when I go to pitch the yeast, I'm going to want to introduce a lot of oxygen. So I'm going to want to be shaking the snot out of this keg, and I want that. If that thing drops off, I'm not going to be able to get any beer out of the keg. Alright, we got about a minute until our first hop addition. So I'm going to apply a little bit of lubricant around the inner seal here. And a little bit to this large O-ring. Grab our lid, feed this over the bale, and I still need this open, so I'm just going to put this back in the sanitizer as is. So I guess I could put it on just to prevent things from dropping in, just in case. Alright, so it's sanitized, poster sanitized. Floating dip tube is on, dip tube has been sanitized, pressure release valve is out, and now we are ready for our first hop addition. 1/2 ounce of Azaka right into the spider. Give it a stir, everything gets nice and saturated. With these very aromatic hops, you can smell them the moment they hit this hot liquid. Smells a little bit like mango, smells a little bit like tropical. That may not be what flavor or aroma is imparted in the final beer. There's a lot of things in hops called survivables, and it literally means what survives to the end product. And so these super volatile aromatic compounds and flavor compounds, it doesn't take a whole lot to get them to either evaporate off or boil off. There's been a lot of research done into what makes hops hoppy, what makes hops flavorful, and how do you kind of goose as much flavor out of those hops into your beer as possible. Especially with hazy IPAs, New England IPAs are all the rage these days. I guess, starting 5-10 years ago, and in a New England IPA and a hazy IPA, they look kind of like this recipe. They don't add any of the hops till the very end, and most of them probably go in as a dry hop. But unlike this recipe, where we are extracting bitterness because the wort is going to stay above 190 degrees Fahrenheit for a long time, they're not going for bitterness. They're just going for full-on hop flavor and aroma. So hopefully this beer is going to be kind of a nice medium, nice mix of those two, where we are going to have bitterness. We're going to have a projected 40 IBU, but then with all these late additions, and especially that ounce of dry hop, it'll be nice and flavorful, nice and aromatic. So if you're just joining us, we're reaching the end of our boil here. Today I am making a golden ale. It's going to be a lot of citrus, tropical hops in the flavor, hopefully. So, looks like I've got about 2.5 minutes till I need to do anything else. We're done with our CIP film. Clean my poor greasy wrench off. Since we are so close to the end of the boil, it's probably safe to take a gravity reading. We're probably not going to lose much more liquid than we already have. So give it a nice big stir so it's all homogeneous. Add a few drops to our refractometer. The nice thing about using a refractometer for gravity readings is that it's just a couple of drops for a sample. So this will chill to room temperature pretty quickly, and that's what we want. We want it to be close to room temperature. If it's too hot or too cold, it'll affect how the gravity is measured. So looks like we're at 10:47 right now. Our target was 10:44, so we're over by just a little bit, really not too much. And then I also want a final volume reading. Looks like we are around 15 quarts, which is what we were shooting for. Alright, I've got one other thing to sanitize. Alright, our 30 minutes is up, so we're going to turn off the timer. Before I turn off the heat, I'm going to add this ounce of Cascade. It smells very, very hoppy. A little bit of citrus, a little bit of grapefruit, a little bit of pine resin almost. I'm a big fan of classic C hops is what they're called, because they usually all start with C, and that is what beers in the Pacific Northwest used for a long time, and that is where I grew up. So I grew up drinking super bitter Northwest IPAs, and those are the types of beers that I like to make myself. Alright, so I feel pretty good that all those hops are dissolved and submerged. So we are going to turn flame off.